I recently sat in the back of a dim university lecture hall, watching a presentation by a well-regarded human geographer. On the massive screen behind him, there was this gritty, high-stakes image. A Jamaican coffee farmer standing knee-deep in mud, staring at a crop just completely destroyed by a hurricane. The whole scene just screamed of urgency, real-world disaster. You would expect the next sentence to be about logistics or aid or concrete solutions, but then the shift happened. The speaker, he didn't talk about the mud. Instead, he began to layer the image with a very specific, almost rhythmic vocabulary. He spoke of sociospatial injustice, performative resilience, and post-colonial entanglements. And what was fascinating was the reaction in the room. As soon as he uttered those complex, abstract terms, the audience visibly relaxed. They nodded in unison, not because the farmer was being helped, but because the speaker had successfully signaled that he belonged to their tribe. It became immediately clear that the devastation on the screen wasn't the point at all. To this academic circle, that farmer's crisis was merely a raw resource fuel to be fed into a machine of theory and citations. The speaker wasn't there to explain the world or fix it. He was there to perform a ritual, using the suffering of others to secure his own tenure.
That's an incredibly powerful illustration.
Yeah.
Because it captures the central crisis we're diving into today perfectly. It's that tension, right? The tension between real, tangible problems and the abstract, often self-serving apparatus of academia. So today, we are focusing squarely on the academic machine itself, the internal systemic pressures, the things rooted in language and methodology and in economics that drive research in fields like international business and development studies to prioritize this abstract performance over genuine, applicable, and frankly, ethical insight.
So we're essentially doing an institutional X-ray. We're looking at how the very structures that are designed to promote scholarly integrity can actually end up compromising it. Our mission for this deep dive is to trace that path, the path from the messy, undeniable reality like that farmer in the mud, all the way to the highly manicured, often completely inaccessible journal publication. And what we find, I think, is a system that, whether it intends to or not, often rewards the wrong outcomes.
It's a crucial path to trace. And, the journey usually begins right where your anecdote started, with language, with how we choose to communicate, or maybe how we choose not to communicate with the people who need the knowledge most.
Okay, let's unpack this language trap. I mean, that opening story really illustrates the failure point. But to be fair, specialized vocabulary isn't inherently evil. It does serve a legitimate purpose, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And we have to start there. Specialized vocabulary is, at its core, necessary. It allows a specific audience, and I really want to emphasize the word specific, to convey complex, abstract ideas with maximum efficiency and precision.
Right, like shorthand.
Exactly. Think about, highly technical fields, advanced engineering, or, say, cardiology. If you have two cardiologists discussing a complex assessment of blood vessel elasticity, they need terms that encapsulate decades of accumulated knowledge in just a single word or phrase.
Of course. They can't stop to define every physiological term.
They'd be massively delayed, and the precision would suffer. So for them, inside that very specialized circle, jargon is a crucial shortcut. It's a tool of efficiency.
But the moment you take that language outside of the expert circle, the whole function shifts. It stops being a shortcut, and it starts being a barrier.
And this is exactly where the failure happens, just like you saw in that lecture hall. Academics, they frequently misjudge their audience's prior knowledge. They deploy these highly specialized terms when they're addressing non-specialists.
So policymakers, other social scientists from fields next door, and this seems the most critical, the development practitioners and NGO workers on the ground, the people who are actually supposed to use the findings.
Yes, and the immediate result is alienation. Instead of feeling enlightened or equipped, the listener just experiences that profound, shameful feeling of not knowing. It's a signal, conscious or not, that the speaker belongs to a privileged intellectual tribe that they are excluded from.
And that exclusion has real consequences.
Profound consequences. It creates this massive widening gap between academic knowledge and applied practice. Think about foreign aid policies or NGO interventions. If I'm a program director and I'm in charge of regional aid distribution, and I read a report on poverty reduction that's filled with terms like sociospatial injustice or post-colonial entanglements.
And the methodology is so opaque because of this complex, difficult to Google Translate academic language.
Right. Then I simply cannot translate those findings into actionable steps. The research at that point has failed its most basic applied mission. It's dead on arrival.
So the intellectual complexity creates an immediate practical failure, and the incentive system just seems designed to reinforce that failure.
It really is. The systemic problem is baked right into the intense competition for publication. I mean, academics are fighting for a very limited number of slots in journals with the highest possible impact levels.
The ones that measure how often their work gets cited.
Exactly. And what often gets rewarded in this highly competitive environment is not accessibility, not clarity, not practical utility, but abstraction and complexity. The research has to demonstrate some kind of cutting-edge theoretical novelty. And unfortunately, novelty often gets confused with complexity and just dense language.
It's like the system rewards building bigger, more architecturally complex intellectual castles instead of building functional bridges that connect those castles to the real world.
That analogy holds up perfectly. And this mechanism creates something we call a feedback isolation loop. If the research is incomprehensible or inaccessible to the practitioners, the people implementing foreign aid, shaping local policies, or building sustainable businesses, then those researchers are completely cut off from meaningful external reality checks.
They never hear the critical feedback.
Never. They never hear someone say, your intricate abstract model of local governance doesn't account for basic logistics or corruption or the existing power structures on the ground. It just doesn't happen.
And without that external feedback, the researchers are left talking only to the people who already speak their language, the internal peer review echo chamber.
And since that echo chamber already rewards complexity and abstraction, the isolation just encourages the creation of even more specialized, more insular theory. It's a closed system that feeds on its own jargon, and it grows more dense and less applicable with every single publication cycle.
Let's connect this specifically to international business research, or IB, because IB scholars, they explicitly aim for practical relevance. They want their findings to be useful to senior executives, right? The people formulating global strategy.
They do. So if the research is inaccessible, it fundamentally fails that executive audience from the get-go. But the barriers aren't just linguistic. They're methodological, too.
Yeah.
The sources we looked at point out that IB research often struggles with methodological approaches that are just far too limited to explain the complexity of executive behavior.
How so?
Well, historically, many scholars have relied very heavily on easily quantifiable demographic proxies. For example, they might try to explain an incredibly complex corporate strategic choice like merging with a competitor or entering a really challenging new market by looking only at surface-level variables.
Things like the CEO's age or their level of education or how long they've been in the office.
Exactly. And you can see how that's a massive oversimplification. You have this complex phenomenon, let's say why a major multinational chooses to liquidate a subsidiary in country X, and you try to explain it with these simplistic variables that barely scratch the surface of the thousands of underlying human, political, competitive, and institutional factors that are driving that specific decision.
It's a black box.
It is. Those demographic proxies, while they're easy to measure and plug into a statistical model, they just don't capture the nuance of corporate motives or preferences or strategic choices. What we really need to measure are the unobservable characteristics of the firm and its decision makers.
So the demand for practical relevance in IB is incredibly high, but the delivery is often compromised right from the beginning by choosing easy-to-measure proxies that have limited explanatory power and then combining that with inaccessible language that prevents a busy executive from even caring enough to read the findings in the first place.
That's the cycle. The knowledge is produced in isolation, it's measured poorly, and it's communicated opaquely. So even if the theory itself is robust, if the measurements are weak and the language is exclusive, the research just becomes a luxury item for the university, not a tool for the world.
Okay, so if jargon creates this high barrier to entry, the tenure system seems to create an intense incentive to manipulate the outcomes inside that system. We really need to look closely at what we're calling the academic engine of abstraction.
And this engine is powered by the entire ecosystem. It's the intense pressure of the university tenure track review, it's the restrictive criteria of the peer review echo chambers, and it's the requirements of federal and foundation grant-making bodies. All of these forces, they collaborate to relentlessly promote theoretical abstraction.
And that often comes at the direct expense of producing research that is replicable, or robustly empirically grounded, or easily verifiable.
Precisely. And this system contributes directly to that large-scale, reproducibility and replicability crisis that was rocked fields across the social sciences and even some of the hard sciences. The sources pinpoint exactly where researchers start making these compromises.
And it's not just one big decision at the end, is it?
No, not at all. The compromises happen in dozens of small decisions made all along the way. Think about the empirical process. A researcher has to decide how they define their variables, how they specify their statistical model, how they develop their sample size and composition, how they identify relationships in the data, and, maybe most importantly, how they perform post-analysis deduction.
That sounds like a very long sequence of forks in the road.
It is. And at every single one of those forks, there are multiple technically correct choices you could make. But those choices can yield vastly different statistical results. And the researcher who is operating under this intense pressure to publish a significant finding, to secure tenure or grant renewal, is highly incentivized to select the pathway that yields the most favorable publishable result.
Okay, let's get to the quantitative evidence that this bias is real. What is the success rate for theoretically derived hypotheses in the top management journals?
Prepare yourself for this one. In the top-tier management and strategy journals, we're talking the absolute elite outlets in this field empirical analysis shows that approximately 89% of theoretically derived hypotheses are empirically supported.
89%. Wait a minute. If that number is true, why do we even need researchers? That implies they can model and predict human behavior and global corporate dynamics almost perfectly. That level of confidence is terrifyingly high for a messy field like social science. Does that mean researchers are getting better at predicting the world or just better at publishing?
It is statistically improbable and overwhelmingly indicative of publication bias. The concept has been known for decades, but the data is getting harder and harder to ignore. This phenomenon is commonly known as the file drawer problem.
The file drawer problem.
The idea is that studies that yield negative results or results that don't support the initial hypothesis, they frequently remain unpublished. They just languish in the researcher's digital dustbin or, the proverbial file drawer. They create this silent, unrecorded body of work that never sees the light of day.
So the published literature becomes massively skewed. Anyone reading it is left with an overconfident body of knowledge, completely unaware of the hundreds of failed attempts or null findings that might have preceded that one published success.
Precisely. The pressure to generate significant positive results is so immense that it drives researchers toward two major questionable research practices, or QRPs, that artificially inflate those numbers.
Let's start with the one that tries to manipulate that significance line: p-hacking.
P-hacking is often called the search for asterisks because journals use asterisks to denote statistical significance. It involves actively pushing your statistical significance levels just below that magic p equals 0.05 threshold.
So what does that look like in practice?
A researcher might spend weeks cleaning the data in various ways, adding control variables one by one, deleting outliers, trying different model specifications, all until they get a result that just scrapes past the threshold for publication. They are, in essence, torturing the data until it confesses.
And you mentioned that this manipulation is so common that it actually leaves a visible trace in the data across the entire published literature. Tell us about this camel-shaped distribution.
This is a truly forensic insight. It's fascinating. When researchers aggregated the reported statistical test results across thousands of studies in top journals, and this includes economics and psychology, they found a distribution that was far from normal. Instead, it formed a distinct camel shape.
A camel shape.
Yes. This curve shows a highly suggestive spike of results that land just past the critical threshold for significance. But crucially, there is a sharp valley, a drop-off of results that land just below that threshold.
Meaning the papers that would have landed in that valley were either filtered out or manipulated until they were pushed over the line and formed the spike.
That's exactly what it implies. It suggests there's a massive filtering mechanism at work, selecting or boosting results that cross that significance line for publication. And this creates an inflation bias that makes the published findings look much more robust and replicable than they actually are.
Okay, then we have the other major QRP, harking. This one sounds like it violates the core philosophy of science itself.
It really does. Harking stands for hypothesizing, after the results are known. This is where a researcher conducts the full data analysis, finds a statistically significant result completely by chance, and then they construct the theoretical predictions and hypotheses to match that result. They then write the introduction and the theory section as if those predictions were made beforehand. when in reality, the data analysis was the guide all along.
So instead of theory informing the empirical tests, the empirical results inform the theory, but the paper is written to hide that fact. What is driving researchers to do this?
The motivation is really survival and coherence. Researchers are under intense pressure to tell a neat, coherent story that matches the conceptual ideas advocated in the study. And they also have the objective of publishing their work, because shirking allows them to retroactively create a perfect theoretical narrative.
But the result, it's hollow.
The result is that when these QRPs are used, the findings become highly sample-specific. They reflect a successful manipulation of that one specific data set and the specific theoretical spin required for that one publication. They don't necessarily reflect a universally applicable, replicable truth.
This sounds like a system of intense institutionalized pressure leading to widespread integrity issues. I mean, how do we even begin to fix a crisis this deep? The material seems to suggest transparency is the key.
Transparency is the only real way to counteract the flexibility that's afforded by QRPs. The foundational step to address AKR arcing is pre-registration.
Pre-registration?
This requires researchers to register their hypotheses, their chosen analytical plan, and their sample design before they collect or analyze any of the data. This creates a non-retractable, time-stamped record of what their initial theoretical predictions were. If the final published hypotheses look significantly different, any reader or reviewer can easily see that deviation.
And what about the p-hacking problem, the constant tweaking of the data?
That's where the open science movement is pushing for even deeper reform. A highly suggested reform is the use of an online research log, or an R-log. This would function as a real-time, non-retractable record where researchers track and publish all the key decisions they made throughout the project.
So every instance of data manipulation, every variable transformation, every outlier they removed.
Every single one. And every analytical step they ran that yielded a non-significant result.
Yeah.
You would essentially be opening the file drawer to the public.
That seems revolutionary.
It would be. Empirical research involves thousands of little decisions to move from raw data to the final clean model. The published methodology section is often just a heavily edited summary that hides the data's true journey. An R-log would provide the necessary detailed, transparent record that allows anyone to fully retrace, audit, and reproduce the work, making p-hacking a much riskier, much more public endeavor.
All right, let's move from issues of transparency to issues of inherent methodological challenges, particularly in quantitative social science research. We're getting deep in the technical weeds here, but the most pervasive problem in international business research seems to be endogeneity.
Endogeneity is.
Yeah.
It's like a detective story, where we can't be sure if the butler committed the crime or if the victim simply chose to be near the butler. It's a pervasive issue. And it stems from the fact that social scientists almost always have to rely on observational data rather than being able to conduct pure randomized controlled experiments. This results in what we call the non-random treatment problem.
Can you walk us through that non-random treatment problem again, maybe with a simpler analogy?
Sure. Let's use a non-academic example. Say we want to study the effect of listening to motivational podcasts. That's the treatment on career success, which is the outcome.
Okay.
Ideally, in a perfect experiment, we would randomly assign half the population to listen to the podcasts and half to listen to silence. But in reality, people choose to listen to motivational podcasts. They self-select.
Based on things you can't see.
Exactly. Unobserved factors. Maybe they are naturally more ambitious, more disciplined, or they have higher cognitive ability. And these unobserved factors also independently lead to career success.
So if you find a positive correlation between listening to the podcast and career success, you can't say the podcast caused the success. It might just be that ambitious people listen to podcasts and ambitious people succeed anyway.
That's it right there. The treatment listening to the podcast was non-randomly assigned. Because we can't isolate the true causal effect of the podcast, our observed correlation is contaminated by those unobserved factors. And this leads to inconsistent estimates of treatment effects, meaning we draw incorrect causal inferences.
Which then translate to distorted and potentially damaging policy implications.
Absolutely. Recommending a policy based on a correlation that is actually driven by unobserved ambition is, well, it's pointless.
The sources provide a great concrete example of this using foreign direct investment, or FDI, and wages. This really helps illustrate the complication of these omitted variables.
Okay, let's assume the initial hypothesis, based on classical economic theory, is that firm-level foreign direct investment is negatively related to wages. The logic being that firms seek out low-cost labor.
Makes sense.
So you conduct a large cross-sectional regression comparing FDI across different regions or countries, and you find a correlation, but it's actually positive. Where there is more FDI, there are higher wages.
That seems to completely contradict the initial logic. Why would the data show a positive relationship if firms are cost minimizers?
And this is where the endogeneity detective work begins. The problem isn't necessarily that the hypothesis is wrong. The problem is that the wage rate is not randomly distributed across these regions. High wages are often a function of underlying, unobserved variables that are not included in your model.
Like what?
Things like high average levels of human capital, education experience, or maybe better physical infrastructure in that region.
So the MNEs, the multinational enterprises, they might not be targeting the high wage areas. They are targeting the high human capital areas, and those areas simply happen to have higher wages as a consequence of that human capital.
Precisely. The effective FDI is confounded by the non-random distribution of these crucial omitted factors. If you don't account for them in your design, your causal inference is distorted by what we call omitted variable bias. The researcher mistakenly attributes the positive wage effect to the FDI itself, when in fact, the higher wages were already pre-existing non-randomly distributed features of that location.
So the takeaway is that researchers have to move beyond simple regression and incorporate methods that explicitly deal with this non-random assignment in their research design.
They must.
This brings us naturally to another systemic flaw: the widespread misuse of control variables. Controls are supposed to improve rigor, but it sounds like they often just introduce more noise.
This is a textbook example of researchers prioritizing model fit over theoretical clarity. Researchers frequently include statistical controls. These are variables extraneous to the core hypothesis for deeply flawed reasons.
Just the most common one.
The simplest one is just laziness. Including them simply because they were used in previous highly cited papers, regardless of whether they are theoretically relevant to the current study's mechanism.
Or, even worse, using them strategically to improve that magical p-value.
Exactly. They include controls strategically to improve statistical significance or to achieve a better overall model fit, which is essentially just p-hacking through methodological manipulation. If a control variable is included without a clear theoretical justification, it can cloud the analysis and unnecessarily reduce your statistical power.
So what's the best practice here? When should a control variable be justified, and what should it be focusing on?
Controls must be selected and justified on purely theoretical grounds before the analysis ever begins. The core goal of a control is not to be associated with the independent variable. Its primary job is to explain a significant portion of the dependent variable's variance.
Okay, so it has to explain the outcome.
Yes. If a control variable is uncorrelated with the outcome you are measuring, and you can't legitimately justify it as revealing some kind of suppressed relationship, it should be excluded. Adding unnecessary, theoretically weak controls just reduces the statistical power of the test that's designed to examine your core hypothesis.
And transparency in reporting is equally important here. How should researchers present the results when they involve controls?
Well, they should always run and report a baseline model that includes only the control variables. It should report their significance levels and their coefficients. Then, they should compare this control-only model to the full model, with and without the core independent variables.
And that lets you see what's really doing the work.
It allows the community, and you, the listener, frankly, to truly assess how much explanatory power the hypothesized independent variables provide, beyond what is already explained by all the background factors. Failing to report that baseline model is a systematic mistake that prevents a full assessment of the core theoretical contribution.
All right, let's tackle survey-based research now, where the method itself can introduce systematic error. We need to talk about common method variance, or CMV.
CMV is a significant challenge. It's defined as systematic measurement error that's shared among variables simply because the researcher used a common data collection method or source. The most famous example is the single respondent survey.
That's where you ask one person to rate, say, their organization's innovative capability and their organization's financial performance on the same questionnaire.
Exactly. And the contamination comes from the fact that the person answering might subconsciously try to maintain consistency, right?
That's the core mechanism. The respondent's natural tendency to provide consistent or socially desirable answers creates an artificial systematic error, a kind of false internal consistency that contaminates the relationship. And this usually results in an inflated correlation.
Right, making the connection between capability and performance look much stronger than it actually is in reality. As one journal editor noted, if there's no evidence of construct validity or variables being measured independently, the study contributes very little.
So the solution is really prevention rather than cure.
Absolutely. The priority must be ex ante research design over relying on ex post statistical fixes.
Yeah.
The ideal strategy is prevention, collecting data from multiple independent sources. Measure capability using a manager survey, but measure financial performance using archival data. Or measure capability using one rater, like the CEO, and performance using another, like the financial controller. We have to prioritize multi-source data collection. Relying on post hoc statistical fixes, like the often insensitive statistical tests, is just insufficient because the systematic error is already baked into the data.
Okay, now let's make sure we clearly distinguish this from its lesser-known cousin, uncommon method variance, or UMV. The distinction here is subtle, but it's crucial.
It is. While CMV is shared systematic error, meaning the bias affects all variables equally, UMV is unshared systematic error. It's also introduced by the method, but it affects each variable uniquely, non-common with the others.
So if CMV is like a smudge on the camera lens that darkens the whole picture, what is UMV?
UMV is more like having a lens flare that only affects the clarity of one specific object in the frame, but not the others. And unlike CMV, which generally inflates correlations, UMV tends to attenuate them.
It weakens them.
Yes. By introducing unshared systematic errors, if, for example, you use two different data collection methods, and each method introduces a unique systematic bias only to the single construct it measures, UMV can reduce the magnitude of the observed relationship.
And the danger of attenuation is that it increases the risk of a type 2 error.
Precisely. A type 2 error means you fail to find a true relationship that actually exists. So UMV can be just as problematic as CMV, but it pushes in the opposite direction. The complexity here is that simply using multi-method data, while it's generally recommended, doesn't eliminate systematic error. It just changes the nature of the bias from a shared inflation CMV to an unshared attenuation UMV. Researchers need to be aware of the specific biases introduced by every single method they employ.
Given this enormous methodological toolkit, all the statistical models, big data, machine learning techniques, it seems like researchers are at risk of getting lost in complexity for complexity's sake. Where does the source material land on the balance between sophistication and clarity?
The overarching guidance is to strive for methodological parsimony. While technology offers incredible computational power for analyzing cross-cultural datasets, simple, straightforward theories, and robust, transparent designs are often superior to overly complex models. Complexity should only be introduced when the theory itself demands it, not merely as a desperate attempt to reduce method variance or to achieve some kind of artificial statistical significance. The ultimate focus must always be on building a coherent, understandable body of evidence.
We've spent a lot of time on the quantitative flaws, p-hacking, endogeneity, method variance. But qualitative research faces its own set of challenges, often around rigor, replicability, and especially generalizability. Let's pivot to the challenges facing qualitative scholars, particularly those who rely on case studies.
The core constraint that's identified in the sources is the prevailing, and I'd say often unnecessarily restrictive view that case studies are suitable only for inductive theory building.
Meaning, they're only good for generating brand new theory from observation.
Exactly. And this limited perspective really undervalues their true potential. And this restrictive view often leads to the misuse of small n qualitative studies.
How so?
Well, small n case studies, where you're just examining one or a few organizations, are inherently ill-equipped for certain tasks, yet they are frequently shoehorned into those roles. You simply cannot use a small sample to infer frequency-based insights, like how often a specific corporate behavior occurs, or to generalize your findings to large, diverse populations.
Right. They just lack the statistical power and the scope for such broad, quantitative claims. And when they attempt it, they invite a lot of methodological criticism.
They do. So if the conventional, purely inductive approach is too limited, how should case study methodology be rethought to maximize its theoretical potential and its rigor? The sources outline 4 distinct and valid approaches for theorizing from case studies. The first is, of course, the conventional one, inductive theory building. But the other 3 offer much-needed flexibility.
What's the second alternative?
The second is using the case study as a natural experiment. In this approach, the specific context, a particular country, a unique organizational crisis, a rare market entry, is used not to build new theory, but to confirm, modify, or extend existing established theory. The setting acts like a laboratory, allowing the researcher to test the boundary conditions of a well-known concept.
And the third approach deals with understanding the subjective experience of the people involved. That sounds like a radical departure from the need for generalization.
It is. This is interpretive sense-making. This method is rooted in the tradition of idiographic social science, which prioritizes understanding the particular case rather than generating universal law-like explanations. It makes a fundamental rejection of the positivist ideal of Verclaren.
Which seeks to explain an action by attributing it to outside causal factors.
Right. And instead, it seeks Verstehen, or deep empathetic understanding of an action through the actor's own subjective experience. So instead of trying to strip away the messiness of context to find a generalized causal law, the researcher embraces the context and tries to understand the unique cultural and psychological dynamics at play.
They value what's called thick description.
Precisely. Detailed narratives that capture the social context, recognizing that the context itself is what imbues human action with meaning. The goal here is not generalization, but understanding the uniqueness of the case in its entirety. This method is fundamentally self-aware. It explicitly rejects the possibility of full objectivity, acknowledging there's no way to establish a single best view beyond contention.
I see how that approach adds immense depth, but what about combining that contextual richness with explanatory power? Is there a method that tries to reject that trade-off?
Yes. The most recent approach outlined is contextualized explanation. This approach aims to combine the deep, thick description sought by interpretive methods with the explanatory rigor that's prized by quantitative and traditional qualitative approaches. It rejects the philosophical trade-off that says you must sacrifice internal validity for contextual insight, or vice versa.
So it's more of a both-and approach.
It is. This view promotes a pluralistic approach. It demands methodological consistency and philosophical self-awareness from the researcher regarding their chosen orientation. It says you can, and you should, seek rich understanding while maintaining explanatory rigor within the bounds of your specific case.
This emphasis on context leads us to methods for handling complex causality. For situations where multiple conditions have to align to produce a single outcome, standard regression models often fail because they assume these linear, symmetrical relationships.
That's right. When causality is complex, and where equifinality is present, meaning multiple combinations of different conditions can lead to the same outcome, we need different tools. That's where fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, or FSQCA, becomes immensely valuable.
Equifinality is a fascinating concept. Can you clarify that for our listeners?
Think of it like a recipe. In a standard linear model, we assume adding more salt makes the dish better in a straight line. But equifinality recognizes that there might be 3 totally different complex recipes that all result in a 5-star meal.
So different paths to the same destination.
Exactly. You might get the 5-star meal if you combine condition A, say high cost, and condition B, complex ingredients. Or you might get the same 5-star meal with condition C, simplicity, and condition D, speed, different causal paths, same successful outcome. FSQCA is built to map those different configurations.
And can you give us that concrete example of how FSQCA maps these configurations in international business research?
Certainly. Consider a study examining the stakeholder orientation of a multinational enterprise subsidiary, specifically whether it focuses narrowly on maximizing shareholder value for the parent or broadly on local non-shareholding stakeholders like the community and local government.
Okay.
FSQCA analysis revealed that a broad, locally oriented stakeholder focus is not caused by a single factor, but by complex configurations of factors. These include internal conditions, like the subsidiary having high R&D intensity or possessing sufficient corporate slack, that is, uncommitted resources, combined with external factors, like the parent M&E's high global revenue or visibility, or the host country's level of development.
So different combinations could get you to the same place.
Exactly. The analysis showed that different combinations of, say, R&D and visibility could both be sufficient for achieving a broad stakeholder orientation. This demonstrated the power of FSQCA to map the complex recipes for a given outcome in a way that standard linear models, which only focus on the net effect of single variables, simply cannot.
That shifts the research question dramatically from what single variable causes Y to what combination of conditions is sufficient for Y. And that brings us to the need to trace these causal mechanisms over time, which requires longitudinal qualitative research, or LQR.
Absolutely. To truly trace causality and understand how processes unfold, we really need to advocate for longitudinal qualitative research. This requires collecting data over multiple distinct time periods, often spanning years or even decades. It allows researchers to trace causal mechanisms not just in a snapshot, but as they evolve and change. It's difficult, painstaking work.
And LQR borrows powerful tools directly from historical methodology.
It does. LQR is immensely strengthened by techniques like periodization, breaking down a complex history into theoretically meaningful eras, and systematic comparative analysis across different time slices. But the most powerful borrowing is the highly disciplined use of counterfactual analysis.
The what-if thought experiment, how is that used rigorously rather than just as an interesting speculation?
In LQR, counterfactual analysis has to be systematic. Researchers must systematically ask, what would have happened to the outcome if our supposed cause or condition had been completely absent? This functions as a rigorous check on the theory. By forcing the researcher to test the consistency and coherence of their proposed causal narrative against plausible alternatives, LQR uses counterfactuals as both a tool for theory generation, the context of discovery, and, critically for theory falsification, the context of justification. This rigorous historical approach is essential for understanding the emergence and evolution of complex social change.
This exploration of methodological flaws and publishing pressures leads us back to the systemic incentives we started with. We have the jargon, the QRPs, the publication bias, all feeding a system that seems detached from solving real-world problems. Let's bring the conversation full circle by looking at the economic incentives driving this whole research landscape. This is the concept of the academic-industrial complex.
This complex functions as a self-perpetuating economic feedback loop. Universities, research centers, major foundations, they all fund academic research that inherently and often profitably dramatizes social crises. They seek funding to study these urgent problems.
And the research, by dramatizing the urgency, then secures the next round of funding, which in turn creates a permanent professional class of experts.
Exactly. A massive class of academics, NGO professionals, consultants, and policy experts whose careers depend not on the resolution of problems like poverty or climate change or global inequality, but on the perpetuation of these problems through ongoing research, publication, and grant applications. In a very perverse sense, the solution for the professional expert class is the continued documentation and theorization of the crisis.
So the academic performance ritual we saw in the lecture hall, where the crisis becomes fuel for theory, is directly tied to career survival within this complex. Now, how does this complex intersect with the reality of global corporations?
It connects through the shifting dynamic of global scrutiny. We are living in a globalized world where the process has effectively diminished the regulatory capacity of individual states. This is especially true when dealing with massive multinational enterprises.
Right. MNEs have grown so powerful that they can often bypass or transcend national laws, or they operate in jurisdictions where laws are simply weakly enforced or even non-existent.
That's the reality. Society, however, only accepts the increased reach and power of these MNEs if those corporations are willing to take on social responsibility that goes far beyond mere legal compliance, particularly in developing countries that lack strong regulatory capacity. This pressure creates a global standard of conduct that is enforced by non-state actors.
And this is where that external scrutiny, the dramatization of the crisis, becomes a powerful regulatory force in itself.
Absolutely. Large MNEs, due to their vast size, their brand visibility, their global revenue, they become highly vulnerable targets for intense scrutiny by transnational monitors, social rating agencies, and activist campaign groups. A high-profile human rights controversy in one location, for instance, can cause massive negative publicity and reputational damage for the associated company globally, irrespective of whether they technically complied with poorly enforced local norms. This global standard often matters more for legitimacy than local adherence.
So the MNEs are constantly balancing this intense external pressure, the activists watching their every move with their own internal business needs. And this creates conflict within the firm structure itself?
It does, and that internal tension is critical to understanding corporate behavior. The corporate parent, headquartered far away, is a crucial internal stakeholder. Pressure from that parent for maximum global efficiency, centralized control, and robust quarterly earnings often narrows a subsidiary's focus strictly to immediate shareholder value.
And this internal demand frequently crowds out the concerns of local, non-shareholding stakeholders, the employees, the local communities, local suppliers.
Meaning that the subsidiary is often pulled in two opposing directions. The corporate headquarters is demanding efficiency, and the local community is demanding social investment. That's the negotiation. Stakeholder orientation is therefore not just a reactive posture to an external crisis. It is an internal resource negotiation within the MNE.
Fascinating.
The mid-range theory that emerges here links these internal resource pressures and external institutional pressures. It shows that when subsidiaries adopt strategic orientations based on developing local knowledge, what are called asset-seeking strategies, they often prompt a broader stakeholder orientation because they need motivated human capital and local legitimacy. Conversely, efficiency-seeking objectives, dictated by the parent, prompt a much narrower shareholder-centric focus. The systemic crisis, the scrutiny, and the resulting academic inquiry all point back to this constant grinding tension inside the MNE.
This has been a truly sobering, yet I think essential, deep dive. We started with that jarring image of the Jamaican coffee farmer, and we realized that his crisis was being metabolized as raw material for intellectual abstraction. And from there, we've uncovered the systemic intellectual crisis behind that image, an academic machine driven by the tenure track that generates abstraction, that rewards questionable research practices like harking and p-hacking, and often deploys methodological complexity that just obscures clarity. It is a system that, at nearly every turn, distances itself from the fundamental goal of robust, clear, and truly applicable knowledge.
And that distance is a product of incentives. The current environment is structured to favor theoretical performance and easily quantifiable publication metrics over the difficult, often unglamorous work of establishing clear causal identification or building richly contextualized, replicable findings that can withstand scrutiny. The systemic rigidity we described, that cycle of crisis dramatization funding the perpetuity of the expert class, that is the reality shaping how research is conducted, interpreted, and ultimately applied today. And it often fails to serve the very people it claims to study. The ability of highly theoretical research to move the needle on real-world problems is inversely proportional to the degree to which its language and methodology serve institutional self-preservation rather than scientific transparency.